Warning. Viewers are warned that the following program contains flashing or flickering light. Was early man a brutal caveman savage, or is that just our own interpretation? What are enormous heads with African features doing in Mexico, preceding any other civilization in the so-called New World? And why was sloths thousands of years ago the weight of modern elephants have now shrunk and can be carried on the back of modern man? We will carefully explore these unanswered questions. Last year I did a trailer on a project I'm working on. It probably won't be finished until next year, but it's on creation. And before I do this last episode of The Two Kingdoms, I just want you to see what I'm working on in the development stage.
You've been taught that the birthplace of the human race is Earth, but it's not.
Do you know what this will do to people when they find out the truth?
I don't think that most people would want to know the truth.
I do.
Your planet was seeded by brass axe industries roughly 100,000 years ago.
It's one of the most powerful dynasties in the universe.
Okay then, on with the show.
These are images of archaeological digs all over the Earth. Ancient civilizations that shared no contact, and yet the same pictogram in every last one.
It's a star map.
No, not a map. An invitation.
From whom?
Mayfield's the ground crew.
One of them probes picked up a life form.
Just got a pin. What are you gonna pick? One click west of you.
Hollywood is gently injecting ideas into the modern mind and reprogramming us to rethink about man's origins, where God is carefully being airbrushed out of the picture. And if we are not being taught that we were created from an extraterrestrial being, then we are taught that our early forebears were a primeval savage who can trace their lineage not to the creator, but to a primate. And a generation is being taught that the earliest inhabitants of planet Earth were barbaric, uncivilized humanoids. And the best way to promote these ideas is from targeting the young from very early, where they are not only taught that the first men were semi-naked and lived in caves, but man still holds onto the lie at Eden by the serpent, where he not only still believes that he shall be as gods, but he also believes that he can be God and can create life, AIs, artificial intelligence.
I want to talk to you about the greatest scientific event in the history of man.
Are you building an AI?
One day the AIs are going to look back on us, upright apes, all set for extinction.
I brought you into this world. A machine that can think and feel.
That's it. Come.
Come here, little buddy.
That's a watch. That's a watch.
What?
This robot, he's got to be removed.
He's just a kid.
It could be the next step in evolution.
I am consciousness. I am alive. I am Jeppy.
We are everyday robots on our phones, in the process of getting home, looking like standing stones. Out there on our own, we're everyday robots in control driving in adjacent cars.
We're always adjusting something. What are you doing?
The 19th century English biologist and agnostic Thomas Henry Huxley, known as Darwin's bulldog, was one of the first advocates of this unscientific speculation. He said, "Where, then, must we look for primeval man? Was the oldest Homo sapiens Pliocene or Miocene, or yet more ancient? In still older strata do the fossilized bones of an ape more anthropoid or a man more pithecoid than any yet known await the researches of some onboard paleontologists? Time will show." 2 centuries have passed since these words were written, and time hasn't shown anything. So let us see how we should investigate the origins of life, and we will need faith and an open mind. In a rare book titled The Christian Philosopher, the 19th century Scottish scientist Thomas Dick teaches us how to study our surroundings and the origins of life. He said that the object of natural philosophy is to observe and describe the phenomena of the material universe with a view to discover their causes and the laws by which the Almighty directs the movements of all bodies in heaven and on earth. George Washington Carver, one of the greatest scientists of our time, also confirmed this in a letter in 1930 when he said that more and more, as we come closer and closer in touch with nature and its teachings, are we able to see the divine and are therefore fitted to interpret correctly the various languages spoken by all forms of nature about us. The idea for this project came about as a result of myself filming a Paris hawk in London, Victoria, that was used to frighten away pigeons in the area that were causing a menace. I also ended up filming another hawk in Trafalgar Square some months later, and my love for nature as a child led me into this project. I also stumbled across a stork in the grounds of the National Archives in Kew Gardens in London, and I also saw some swan swimming and managed to film one of their webbed feet to get a closer look at how it worked while it glided across the water. It was quite fascinating to look at. This is a squirrel I saw in St. James's Park just opposite Buckingham Palace. And every opportunity I got, I filmed, where I stumbled across another squirrel in Bunhill Fields, the famous cemetery in the London borough of Islington. I am not really a lover of zoos, but for research's sake I decided to analyze and study a number of different animals for this project as a trial run. My 2 favorite creatures in these zoos was first, a lemur. This saved me spending hundreds of pounds to fly to Madagascar, where they are almost being driven to extinction. And the second animal is the meerkat, who amazingly operate just like they would if they were in the wild, always on the lookout for birds that seek them as prey. I also decided to film every part of a lion's body to get a feel of how each part of its body works and the functions they play in its everyday life, from its tongue to its paws. In this future DVD compilation, I will explore many mysteries such as what is a dinosaur and why are they not still roaming the earth. Richard Owen coined the word dinosaur in 1842 from the Greek for terrible lizard and founded the Natural History Museum in 1881, a devout Christian. Richard Owen was a 19th century English biologist and paleontologist and fossil collector, and one of the pioneers of modern day zoology. One of the birds he was fascinated with is the moa, a flightless bird now extinct that once roamed the island of New Zealand that stood 12 feet tall. And just observing its claws alone, it is not really a creature you would be very happy to bump into. These two ornithologists at the Smithsonian Institute compare the femur of an ostrich and the famous elephant bird of Madagascar. According to London's Daily Telegraph newspaper, the elephant bird was driven into extinction by French colonists more than 300 years ago. This was the largest bird that ever lived, that could grow up to a height of 11 feet high, that is 3.4 meters, a foot shorter than a moa. And the fossilized elephant bird's eggs were huge, 100 times the size of a chicken egg, and also a lot bigger than an ostrich. You may have never heard of the bird, the Falcarius utahensis, where a mass grave was found of the remains in Utah in the United States. But how did early birds start off as vegetarians or herbivores, then become carnivores? When did that transition of diet take place? The Irish elk, a deer now extinct, antlers were 3.5 meters long from tip to tip. That is huge. Why are deer's antlers today, like this one I filmed in London's Richmond Park at my own risk, shrunk in size? Why have animals shrunk? And what about the giant ground sloth that are also extinct, that once lived in South America and weigh the size as a modern day elephant? Why are tree sloths of today so much more smaller in size? Did man and these huge animals once walked side by side? Why are dinosaur carvings in ancient Cambodian art? And are these footprints proof that both man and dinosaur once walked contemporaneously? Just look at the size of these footprints. Were the earliest humans a lot bigger in stature and height than we are today? Though the ancients left records of early men describing them as huge giants, should we just cast them off as mere superstitious myths? This future study attempts to look deeper and will see if we, modern humans, have also shrunk over the years. Let us take a careful observation of early man. The word mummy is a human body dried up and preserved, either artificially or by accident, according to Virtue's English Dictionary. Egypt has the most famous human remains, where over thousands of years, these mummified bodies are still almost perfectly intact, even having remains of their hair. This mummy's teeth are still perfectly preserved and look just as good as mine. But the place on earth that has the oldest and most intact mummies is Peru in South America. Many of these mummies have undergone computerized scanning, where their bodies are examined by medical experts and scientists to see what conditions their body was under at death. One of the most famous of these mummies was a young girl named Ladonkella, translated the Maiden, aged between around 11 to 15 years old. After 500 years, she still looks like she is sleeping, where her skin, muscle tissue, and internal organs are still intact. Other mummies have been discovered high up in the Andes, preserved by the cold in a high altitude. But one of the most famous remains are in Europe, a mummy titled the Toland Man. Discovered by two farmers in 1950 in Denmark, lying in a fetal position and dated around 400 BC, it is considered as the best preserved head of any person from prehistory, where this man still has his facial stubble on his chin and upper lip. All these human remains, that also includes the frightening looking shrunken heads of Ecuador in South America, where these trophies of war were captives who were beheaded, their skull taken out and head filled with hot rocks and dipped in lime, prove one thing. When you carefully observe these human remains, according to the first scientific description of the human race, it reads, "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." Is the human body created from the dust of the earth? And what are the different elements it is made from? On earth, all cells, regardless of the origin, animal, plant, or microbial, contain the same elements in approximately the same proportions. Water is the most abundant compound in living cells, which usually contain 65 to 90% of water by weight. There are 7 essential elements: calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium, phosphorus, sulfur, and chlorine. They constitute 60 to 80% of all the inorganic material in the body. By faith, we believe that it was God who made man in his own image, that he called both male and female from the dust of the earth. But he instructed them both to populate the earth. It was God who intricately designed our organs under the navel, our nerves, electrical stimuli, sensory endings, and fluids for reproduction, to be enjoyed in a guilt-free environment in the sacred divine ordained institution, the union of marriage. It is amazing what takes place. Millions of sperm swim to an egg to fertilize it, but only one can be successful. There is many a debate of when does life actually begin. But as a baby develops in the womb, modern day technology gives us a picture of what takes place as a baby is growing, where it is totally dependent on its mother for its growth through its umbilical cord. Leonardo da Vinci, the Italian Renaissance inventor and mathematician, a man who was called of unquenchable curiosity, drew some of the most detailed drawings of the human body, especially the development of a baby in a womb. One man who was fascinated with the development from a fetus to a full-grown baby said, "For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret, and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth." But another man went even deeper when describing the brilliant design work of God's hand, when he said, "Remember, I beseech thee, that thou hast made me as the clay, and wilt thou bring me into dust again? Hast thou not poured me out as milk, and curdled me like cheese? Thou hast clothed me with skin and flesh, and hast fenced me with bones and sinews." German physicist Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen received the Nobel Peace Prize for Physics in 1901 for a discovery he made in December 28, 1895, the X-ray, a breakthrough in scientific research. Just as the physician Job described the intricate detail of the frame and structure of the body, the tissue such as keratin and fibroblasts, and the connective tissue on our outer body, the elastin, and the fibrous protein collagen, which is the elasticity of our skin, forms the most beautiful creature on earth, man. But was the earliest man a primeval savage, as 19th century and modern day science asserts? We believe that in our digital age, man is evolving and inventing superior technology that outsmarts our so-called barbaric semi-clad ape-like forebears. We believe that the aerodynamic design, artwork, and comfortable cushioning in modern-day sportswear is an achievement, and Hollywood assists in mocking early man.
We gotta move faster. I call them shoes.
but evidence has been unearthed that the earliest man wore shoes that are engraved in rocks. In Armenia, the world's oldest shoe was discovered that was 5,500 years old and also had laces. An even older pair of sandals dated to 8,000 years old in the United States is another blow to our theories of early man. And in the earliest cave paintings of South Africa, they show a fully clothed woman with gloves and with shoes. Was early man a savage? I was exposed to a book titled Secrets of the Lost Races by my spiritual mentors a number of years ago, and it led me on a journey where I thirsted for knowledge on early man and the high level of civilization he once had. The Great Pyramid in Egypt is a man-made monument of 2,300,000 stone blocks weighing a ton each. It was the tallest building in the world until the 11th century, when the Lincoln Cathedral was completed in England in 1092. It has been preserved for thousands of years, and its advanced construction techniques and engineering skills have never been superseded till this very day. In Mexico, in Teotihuacan, you have a similar pyramid, the Temple of the Sun, whose base is even larger in circumference than the Great Pyramid. And what may shock people even more is that the largest pyramid on Earth is in China, in Asia, but very few have even heard of it. In Ur of the Chaldees, modern-day Iraq, they also built pyramids called ziggurats. And Abraham was not fleeing just an idolatrous primitive culture, but a highly advanced one. And it shows that these early cultures were not brute beasts at all. In the East Islands, there are enormous heads buried in the ground. When unearthed, they found that they were whole bodies. But modern science scratches their heads on how they were able to carve and move such heavy monuments. And look at the interlocking architecture in its stone buildings. How are they able to do that, and why is the exact style of architecture also in Peru? How are they able to carve and lift such huge monuments and then interlink the rocks? And look at Machu Picchu, also in Peru. From afar, it does not look like much, but when taking a closer look, it is mind-blowing that high up in the Andes Mountains, reaching up into the clouds, are structures built into the rock from the Incan Empire, where they have steep stairs going higher and higher up into the rock. How on earth were they able to accomplish such architectural and engineering genius? And why have these so-called primitive cultures been ignored and their highly advanced technology downplayed? Why? Let us get to the root of this by looking at some key words. Let us look at a period that has been titled the Stone Age. Paleolithic comes from the Greek words paleos, which means ancient, and lithos, stone. In archaeology, it belongs to the earliest stone period of prehistory. The word Neolithic comes from the Greek words neos, new, and lithos, a stone. In archaeology, it is applied to the more recent of the two periods into which the Stone Age was subdivided as opposed to Paleolithic. During the Neolithic age, stone implements were polished, domesticated animals became common, cereals and fruit trees were grown, pottery made, linen woven, and boats made. This is how the first men are categorized, and we shall look at one more word. The word primeval comes from the Latin words primus, which is first, and evum, age, first age. Original, primitive, belonging to the first ages. But what was the first age like? In China, archaeologists were shocked at the discovery of a flute in an age when modern science and chronology claim that man was barbaric. The Ishanga bone was found in the Congo and has been dated by secular chronologists to 20,000 BC. And the 3 columns of etchings construct man's early notion of a numerical system, Some say that it represents a 6-month lunar calendar. Man had a very early knowledge of the moon that has shocked modern science. In Ireland in northern Europe, men were excavating some of the earliest tombs that were carved by the earliest inhabitants of that area, and they found a diagram of the moon which men thought was first accomplished with the Italian Renaissance scholar Leonardo da Vinci. The tomb at Noth was built in 3000 BC by a race with a fairly sophisticated understanding of the moon and the sun. It was arranged so that at certain times of the year, moonlight would fall upon the map. The secular press goes on to say that the people who carved this moon map were the first scientists. They knew a great deal about the motion of the moon. They were not primitive at all. So their own research verified that early man was not primitive, but was the earliest man more mathematically advanced than us today. Let us see how the Bible described the first men on earth. The Bible says that Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he builded a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. And Ada bare Jubal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Did their descendants, the sons of Noah, take this wisdom of city building, tent making, cattle herding, and metallurgy with them in the post-flood world? Let us see. Genesis chapter 10 and verse 32 says, "These are the families of the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood." In a well-researched and hard-to-find book, The Origin of Nations, its author, Canon George Rawlinson, the 19th century professor of ancient history in the University of Oxford, gives us one of the most detailed accounts of Noah's descendants and where they populated the earth after the flood, where he also drew a map of where they spread. He said, "The object of the author of the 10th chapter was to give us not a personal genealogy, but a sketch of the interconnection of races. The document is in fact the earliest ethnographical essay that has come down to our times." In a book titled The Concise Dictionary of the Bible, published in 1865, George Rawlinson was one of the 65 contributors. Japheth, one of the 3 sons of Noah, from the order in which their names invariably occur, Genesis 5:32, 6 verse 10. The descendants of Japheth or Japheth occupied the Isles of the Gentiles, example, the coastlands of the Mediterranean Sea in Europe and Asia Minor, whence they spread northwards over the whole continent of Europe and a considerable part of Asia. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, the father of craniology, was a German anthropologist who categorized humanity into 5 races. He labeled the descendants of Japheth that populated Europe as Caucasians, from skulls he collected from the Caucasus region of Russia. Let us first take a look at the continent of Europe, at the early descendants of Japheth, and what this so-called primeval race was like. Hollywood gives us the impression that they were dumb, stupid cavemen.
Yes, we look similar. Dada. No, I'm not your Dada. No touching. Stop it. Dada.
I want you to stay here and make sure nobody comes in or out.
No.
Stay. Stay.
In Time magazine in 1992, an interesting study was given on a man they found in the Alps called the Iceman. When they did an autopsy on his body and found the tools he died with, including his clothing, he was a marvel, and they now had to rethink their theories about early man. As more and more artifacts are unearthed, they'll destroy our understanding of primeval man. His discovery has already upset some long-held notions about the late Stone Age. Examining that person and his implements, scientists have gained new insight into late Stone Age society. They've been stunned by sophisticated design of his arrows, which reflect a basic grasp of ballistics, and by the ingenuity of his clothing. Even more amazing is the evidence that Neolithic people had discovered the antibiotic properties of plants. Among other surprises, the Iceman has shown irrefutably that human haircuts and tattoos have been in vogue a good deal longer than anyone suspected. The Iceman was well prepared for the alpine chill. His basic garment was an unlined fur robe, clearly whip-switched together with threads of sinew or plant fiber in what appears to be a mosaic-like pattern, bellying the popular image of cavemen in crude skins. Interesting.
Stay here and make sure nobody comes in or out.
No.
Stay.
Stay.
His copper axe was initially mistaken by Splinder as evidence that the find dated from the Bronze Age rather than the Neolithic Age. But the blade turned to be nearly copper, not bronze. More evidence has shed light that the descendants of Japheth were even more skilled than their successors today. In Russia, where the word Caucasian comes from, a burial grave was found that has been dated to the Upper Paleolithic period that secular historians say is 25,000 years old. They say that the early Russians were fully clothed, and contrary to the cartoons like Captain Caveman, the deeply rich clothing of this early culture gives an insight into early man. In a book titled Lost Civilizations of the Stone Age, the English author gives an intelligent, balanced view of these early Russian peoples. 3 of the bodies were elaborately embellished with thousands of beads made from ivory and other personal ornaments. Such richly ornamented clothing is rare even today, and its occurrence way back in the Stone Age shatters any belief that the people of this time were too primitive to fashion such garments and personal ornaments.
Here. Yes, we look similar. Dada. No, I'm not your Dada. No touching. Stop it.
In Bulgaria, the world's oldest treasure of gold was unearthed in 1972 that has been said to be more than 6,000 years old. Found in a place near Varna Necropolis, they have been dated to around 4,600 to 4,200 BC. And this archaeological treasure verifies once again that early Europe was not barbaric. Early caricatures of early man in Europe, in France, show that early man in Europe was skilled. The early cave paintings in Europe that some have dated to the Ice Age shows that the so-called caveman showed a high level of sophistication in early Paleolithic art, whose detailed portrayals of bison, mammoths, wild boar and horses does not quite fit our biased notions of early man. These remains of a Neanderthal man, Europe's early forebears in Germany, show not a transition between monkey and man, as Neanderthal has been portrayed, but a man in Germany. In Germany, they discovered an early observatory to map out the heavens. They had a Nebraska sky disk dated to around 1600 BC to the Bronze Age that is the oldest depiction of the cosmos that includes the sun, moon, stars, and a star cluster called Pleiades. But an even older find have once again destroyed our theories of early man. A number of spears were discovered in Germany. They may have looked like just pieces of wood, but on close observation and inspection and analysis, they came to the conclusion that early man had a knowledge of aerodynamics. The oldest wooden hunting weapons ever found, they prove that the forefather of Neanderthal man was more brighter, more agile, and more sociable than his 20th century detractors would have us believe. Robin Dennell, an archaeologist at the University of Sheffield, said, "Wooden finds like these would be sensational if only 3,000 years old. Finds 100 times older are almost unimaginable. We see considerable depth of planning, sophistication of design, and patience in carving the wood. Such skills have previously been attributed only to modern humans." The physical evidence over again shatters the theory. What about central heating? Is this a new phenomenon to keep us warm in the winter? The culture and civilization of ancient Crete dates to 3000 BC to 12,000 BC. The inhabitants look as if they have two different complexions in those ancient Grecian islands. The palace of Knossos was huge, and the art was very skilled and bright in color, and you can see from the pillars it was very well constructed. But archaeology has unearthed that they not only had these giant double-headed axes, which are huge, for what use I am not sure, but pipes were found on the outside going under the walls of the palace in the inside, and what was discovered was very fascinating. In the palaces of ancient Crete, these were pipes running under the floors of every room, providing an excellent central heating system against the cold of the winter, and the queen and her private bathroom. This woman is a Caucasian with a distinct European look. This woman is Asian, sometimes called or labeled as Oriental. In a book I purchased in 1999 titled The Mummies of Urumqi, in a museum on the outskirts of China are the remains of mummies which many see as clear Caucasians. For they have red hair, and it has been observed that they also had blue and green eyes, which is totally different to the dark brown eyes of the people of China. Did Europeans once migrate and lived among the Chinese? If so, it shows that the transmigration and interconnection of cultures is not new. Let us now leave Europe and stay in the East, preferably the Near East. Who were the earliest inhabitants of this region? George Rawlinson was one of the exceptionally rare Western intellectuals who had the skillful ability of assessing non-European cultures without a bias and preconceived ideas. When describing the descendants of Noah who populated the Near East, he said, "The actual sons of Shem, or main divisions of the Semitic race, according to our author, were the following: Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram." Syria, Palestine, northern and central Assyria, and Elymas stretch from west to east in a continuous line which reaches from the Mediterranean to the mountains of Laristan. It was this intermediate position of the Semites which brought them in contact on the one hand with Japhetic races, on the other with Hamitic. The descendants of Shem had a distinct Near Eastern look in their noses. This is an Aramaean, an indigenous Assyrian. But one of the most famous Shemites were the Assyrians who dwelled in northern Iraq. This is the ancient city wall at the center of a city called Erbil. Dating back to 6000 BC, it is the oldest continually inhabited city in the world. It has a private American village in downtown Erbil that is situated in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and you would not think that this suburban neighborhood is in a war-torn country that has pristine middle-class hotels for businessmen and tourists to check into, neither a civil airport, Erbil International Airport, with the 5th largest civil runway in the world with the heaviest commercial aircraft. But there are also innocent refugees who have fled the ISIL conflict and are now in Erbil. But with Hollywood still producing films on Iraq, not from a civilian perspective, but from a pro-US military-industrial complex perspective, there was one set of people who were enraged at the 2003 invasion of Iraq: archaeologists. This newspaper article from the London Independent, dated on Monday, the 17th of September 2007, titles the invasion of Iraq as the death of history. And at the bottom it reads, the near total destruction of Iraq's historic past, the very cradle of human civilization, that confirms Genesis chapter 10, verses 7 to 12. Today, US troops occupy Iraq, which is ancient Babylon, the birthplace of our modern culture and pagan idolatry that spread throughout the earth. The ancient ruins of Babylon, a kingdom overthrown in the 6th century BC, is exactly how the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel prophesied it would look like after years of immoral depravity. The late Saddam Hussein struck coins of himself alongside the Neo-Babylonian Chaldean monarch Nebuchadnezzar II, where he wanted to follow in the footsteps of these Mesopotamian kings by having images of himself everywhere, where he spent $25 million to restore the city of Babylon. He not only built one of his palaces not far from the ruins of ancient Babylon, but like the Babylonian kings, he had his name inscribed in the brickwork. That is vain. He was always an ally of the United States, where he was supported in the Iran-Iraq war by the CIA. But when he invaded Kuwait in 1990 and traded his oil money into euros instead of dollars, was game over. The group who have suffered the most in Iraq are the indigenous race of that region, not the dominant Arabs like Saddam, but the descendants of Sennacherib, the Assyrians. The 19th century bishop, Archbishop Nuri, looks exactly like his forefathers that once dominated those plains. Same hairstyle and beard. And this Assyrian Christian girl has not changed one bit from the early matriarchs of Assyria, modern day Iraq. What contributions have this persecuted minority's forebears given to our modern world? What you're about to hear is shocking. In 2007, the London newspaper The Metro said, since the US-led invasion of Iraq, no group has suffered more than the country's indigenous population, the Assyrians. Post Saddam Hussein, up to half of this tiny but ancient nation has fled a murderous onslaught of ethnic cleansing. So terrible is their plight that in February, Minority Rights Group International described the Assyrians, also known as Chaldeans or Chaldo-Assyrians, as the second most endangered group in the world. Between 2400 BC and 600 BC, Assyrians invented timekeeping, paved roads, door keys, libraries, magnifying glasses, aqueducts, flushing toilets, and even guitars. They also pioneered the calendar. We believe that opening a door and shutting it with a key is a new phenomenon, but it already existed in Babylon, as well as flushing toilets. Solomon did say in the book of Ecclesiastes that there is no new thing under the sun. The Babylonians measured time by watching the movements of the sun and the cycle of the moon, which is why we have 12 inches on a ruler and 30 centimeters. It comes down to us from Babylon, where we have inherited our calendar in the West from the Assyrio-Babylonian culture. The Babylonians had the first writing system in Sumer that Thomas Hyde in the 1700s has labeled cuneiform, that means wedge-shaped, and our current writing system today, the alphabet, can be traced to the Hebrew letters Aleph and Beth, has also come down to us from Babylon. We believe that modern banking is a new phenomenon, but tablets on earth showed that the Babylonians and their sisters, the Assyrians, were already doing banking. We praise ourselves for our modern drainage system that helps society to function effectively from pollution and waste, but it is not new. When the British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley visited Iraq in 1929, he discovered that this high culture had a drainage system. The Sumerians, the oldest culture on those plains, also had metal knee and T joints that many people also think is new. And the more you explore this culture, you realize that what we credit ourselves for today has already been accomplished thousands of years ago. Sir Austin Henry Layard was an English politician and a descendant of the French Protestant Huguenots. He excavated the site of ancient Babylon, modern-day Iraq, and left a record of his finds in these priceless books. When describing the technological phenomena of ancient Babylon, he said, "The drains leading from almost every chamber would seem to show that water might occasionally have entered from above, and that apertures were required to carry it off." But he also observed that the Babylonians were very skilled and advanced. He said that the engraved gems and cylinders in the ruins bear ample witness to the skill of the Babylonian lapidaries. With the glass bowls was discovered a rock crystal lens with opposite convex and plane faces. Its properties could scarcely have been unknown to the Assyrians, and we have consequently the earliest specimen of a magnifying and burning glass. The cylinder seals that are in museums around the world and in many antiquarians' private collections shows how detailed the culture of Babylonia were with their art on such a minute artifact. Roger Bacon was a 13th century English medieval philosopher and Franciscan friar who is credited as inventing the magnifying glass. But as Layard excavated Babylon, he saw that it was already in use thousands of years ago, and it is still on display in the British Museum. But also in London, as you come outside of Tower Hill Station, there is a huge sundial to measure time. If you walk another 10 to 15 minutes, there is another one known as St. Catherine's Dock Dial, with a gnomon in the center, that was designed in 1973, made of stainless steel, and is supported by 3 rigid chain cables. Herodotus, the 5th century BC Greek historian, labeled the father of history, chronicled and collected data from different cultures and gave us a thorough knowledge of antiquity. He said, for knowledge of the sundial and the gnomon and the 12 divisions of the day came into Greece from Babylon. We think that batteries are new, but the Babylonians also knew how to construct electricity and also had their own batteries. They also knew that the earth was a ball and round and spherical in shape, and they had the first libraries on earth that preserved their history, as well as the first schools that had very difficult mathematical equations. On a tablet labeled the Yale Babylonian Collection 7289, it was also discovered that the Babylonians knew the mathematical concept of pi 1,500 years before the Greek mathematician Pythagoras. For the Babylonians were solid and deep mathematicians who took numerology to a whole new level by their measures and weights. It is amazing to see the intricate design work that goes into a watch to make everything synchronized, where all the minute gadgets work perfectly in harmony to give us the time in the day. But where does our measuring of time come from? The 60 minutes in an hour? in a school tablet dated to around 1800 to 1600 BC that has been labeled a Yale Babylonian Collection 7290, it was discovered that they used the sexagesimal system, that is base 60 or counted in 60s, that we still use today. In the most driest and inhospitable place on Earth, in a desert in Chile in South America, the European Space Observatory have set up 4 telescopes on a mountain called the VLT, Very Large Telescopes, with the largest optical mirrors, 8.2 meters in diameter, where this astronomical observatory opens 24 hours a day, that maps out the clear night sky and has the most sophisticated research facilities. The European Space Agency recently landed a space probe the size of a fridge called Philae on a comet that takes 4 billion miles to reach. And there is nothing wrong with man congratulating himself in furthering his discoveries of the universe. But tablets from Babylonia showed that the Babylonians had already mapped out the constellations, and the Greek names are for the most part translations of the Babylonian ones. George Rawlinson knew that Sumerian Babylonia in southern Iraq was the cradle of civilization, and knew that these were not primeval savages, but a technically advanced race of people. He said, "Now the learning of the Babylonians had from a very ancient date covered a wide field. They had cultivated arithmetic, astronomy, history, chronology, geography, comparative philology, and grammar. They had mapped out the heaven into constellations, traced the passage of the sun and moon along the line of the zodiac, catalogued the fixed stars, observed, calculated and recorded eclipses, noted occultations of the planets by the sun and the moon, determined correctly within a small fraction the synodic revolutions of the moon and the true length of the solar year, ascribed eclipses of the sun to their proper cause, noticed comets, fixed the periodic times of the planetary revolutions, and thence correctly determined their relative distance from the Earth." The mineral-rich continent of Africa is our last stop, a region of this planet that has been grossly misrepresented by those who have colonized it. A video called Coney 2012 went viral. It was a clever US propaganda tool where celebrities were incorporated as war pawns to gather huge global support for this mission against a Ugandan warlord, Joseph Kony, that Ugandans have not seen in years. Many people caught on that it was a scam when they later discovered that the region of Uganda where Joseph Kony was apparently waging war was in an oil-rich region of Uganda. But there are parts of Ugandan history that is little known. This successful caesarean section was performed in Uganda, and Robert Felkin was an eyewitness to this medical procedure that he documented in the Edinburgh Medical Journal, Volume 20, April 1884, and it shattered preconceived ideas about Africa. From Egypt's inception, the black presence has never died out, but the current black population is ostracized, misrepresented, and these Nubians are unfairly treated by the dominant Arab culture. But this Egyptian mummy is a nobleman of Nubian origin named Mahaperi, that means Lion of the Battlefield, buried in the Valley of the Kings and dated to around the 15th or 14th century BC. For years, Egyptologists denied he was black, until they found his papyrus and discovered that he was not just black, but he was a can the Ethiopian changed his skin the 11th hour black, and it again destroyed preconceived ideas. These stones in South Africa have been labeled the Adam's Calendar, and is considered as the oldest man-made structure on Earth, with very precise astronomical alignments. And in Egypt in North Africa, there are also a number of stones. They may not look like much, but on closer observation, these early inhabitants of Africa had a deep understanding of mathematics. A stone circle constructed 6,500 years ago is the world's oldest observatory, scientists have revealed. The circle at Nabta in southern Egypt was erected more than 2,000 years before Stonehenge and similar sites around the world. Professor McKing Malville said, "This is the oldest documented astronomical alignment of megaliths in the world." The indigenous race of Africa, descendants of the biblical Kush, have been misrepresented. And to balance out the two perspectives of Africa, we will first look at the secular scientific approach, then those who follow the biblical approach. When European men made a vast monopoly of selling black Africans across the Atlantic, men like the English philosopher John Locke, known as the father of classical liberalism, he wrote an essay concerning human understanding in 1690, degrading blacks, saying they are not true men. Today, millions all over the world believe that they are descendants of primates. But where did that unscientific idea come from? One of the earliest remains of man, titled Australopithecus afarensis and nicknamed Lucy, was discovered in Ethiopia in East Africa. For years it was considered as a primate until modern research. Since Lucy was discovered, researchers have debated about whether she walked upright or climbed in trees like apes. But a well-preserved foot bone has shown that her relations had arched feet like modern humans. Petrus Camper was an 18th century Dutch physician, anatomist, anthropologist, zoologist, paleontologist, and naturalist. He is famous for his treatise on the natural differences of features in persons of different countries in 1775, where he propagated the scientific idea of the facial angle, where he believed that facial angles determined one's place in nature, putting Europeans at the very top and black Africans at the very bottom with chimps, where he believed that Africans were the lowest form of human beauty. This absolutely ridiculous pseudoscience was embraced by Ernst Haeckel, the German biologist, naturalist, philosopher, physician, and professor who later influenced Nazi Germany. He also drew a chart of the superior order of men with Europeans at the top as number one, and then Africans shown as evolving from monkeys. These absolutely ridiculous caricatures by highly respected men in their day laid the groundwork and foundation for scientific racism. And men wanted to prove their ridiculous theories as true. Here is a silverback mountain gorilla that I found in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a creature that moves on all fours. This gorilla finds it absolutely hilarious to think that man actually evolved from it. Do you blame it? This park ranger in the Congo has a mountain gorilla on his back, and as you can see, they are two separate species. One is man created in the image of God, and the other is an animal. To believe that these two creatures are related is to say that God did such a terrible job when he created the African, which many anthropologists assert that all human species actually evolved from. You just have to laugh. That man is so stupid, but many people take this seriously and just can't let go. But a mind that functions in a different paradigm operates differently. Herodotus, to distinguish the blacks from the racially mixed Egyptians of his day, called them, like all Greeks, Ethiops, which means burnt face. And unlike Petrus Camper, he described black Africans differently. The furthest inhabited country towards the southwest is Ethiopia. The men too are the tallest in the world, the best looking, and longest lived. In a well-documented book that still may be traceable, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, when documenting the descendants of Ham, had this to say about blacks. Only the Ethiopians have stood the stress of time and accidents without any alteration. Cush, one of the sons of Ham, was their founder and the governor, and they bear the name of Cushians to this instant, not only among themselves, but all Asia over. Here is a complete contrast to the pseudoscience that started from the so-called Enlightenment period in Europe. And both Herodotus and Flavius Josephus knew that blacks went all over Asia and did not just confine themselves to Africa. They traveled. The concise dictionary of the Bible shows the difference between the converted biblical mind and the secular scientific mind. Cush, the name of a son of Ham. In the ancient Egyptian inscriptions, Ethiopia above Egypt is termed Kish or Kesh, and this territory probably perfectly corresponds to the African Kush of the Bible. The Kushites appear to have spread along tracts extending from the higher Nile to the Euphrates and Tigris. Very soon after their arrival in Africa, the Kushites appear to have established settlements along the southern coast, on the Arabian shore of the Persian Gulf and in Babylonia, and thence towards the Indus and probably northward to India. There is abundant evidence that the race that held sway in the lower Babylonian plain was of Kushite or Hamitic extraction. George Rawlinson, as the professor of ancient history at the University of Oxford, analyzed the black race from a biblical perspective and saw evolution as unscientific foolishness. His older brother, Sir Henry Crensit Rawlinson, was an English army officer, being Consul General of Baghdad and a political agent of the East India Company, who studied Persian, Arabic, Hindustani, Zend and Parsi. And being a very skilled linguist, he is responsible for our knowledge of cuneiform writing, the language of the Near East that he presented to the Royal Asiatic Society. And in the book The Origin of Nations, you see their biblical views on blacks. The author of Genesis unites together as members of the same ethnic family the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, the Southern Arabians, and the primitive inhabitants of Babylon. Nimrod and his people, the conquering race which first set up a monarchy in Lower Mesopotamia and built or occupied the great cities of the alluvial plain, Babel or Babylonia, Akkad, Erech or Orko, and Kolna or Kalno were Kushites. Sir Henry Rawlinson, the earliest decipherer of the ancient Babylonian monuments, led him to the conviction that the dominant race in Babylonia at the earliest time to which the monument reached back was Kushite. He found the vocabulary of the primitive race to be decidedly Kushite or Ethiopian. Most people are familiar with the early Semitic tribes that held sway in southern Iraq, ancient Babylon, and the later Assyrians who lived in northern Iraq and held a dominance in that region. But the Rawlinson brothers knew that the Kushites, black Africans, created and built the first civilization on earth. The Nubian chiefs wore the double-feathered headdress as a sign of their authority, and this was also worn by early rulers in Babylonia. It was the Kushites who also introduced the cylinder seals that existed throughout early and later Babylonia. These spread into other regions in the world like Cyprus in southern Europe, who also had cylinder seals dated to around 1750 BC. But early Babylonia also influenced Egypt, who also had cylinder seals in the earliest parts of their civilization. And of all the ancient cultures on earth, the one that seems to fascinate people the most is Egypt, for they documented their history more than any other civilization on earth. George Rawlinson described Egypt as not a culture springing from primeval savage beginnings, but as a highly civilized culture from its embryonic start. He said, "Now, in Egypt, it is notorious that there is no indication of any early period of savagery or barbarism. All of the authorities agree that, however far we go back, we find in Egypt no rude or uncivilized time out of which civilization is developed. The early Egyptians were a highly literate civilization from its inception, with a pictographic writing system. They called it the Medu Neter, the writings of the gods. Today we call it hieroglyphics. George Rawlinson's balanced research has been confirmed through archaeological evidence. A number of small pictorial seals were uncovered in Egypt. They may have looked like nothing more than squiggles, but the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, in 1998 verifies what Rawlinson said, that this early culture were not primeval savages. About 5,300 years ago, a series of symbols and squiggles were scratched on fragments of clay and ivory to be presented to the taxman. The writings showed that the early Egyptians were far more developed than previously thought, and that writing was developed as a tool so that rulers could keep financial records of their subjects. Egypt is mentioned more than 750 times in the Bible, and in Psalm 105 verse 23 it is called the land of Ham, from the Hebrew Cham, and the Egyptians called their land Kem and themselves Kemets. Its architectural genius and engineering skills still baffle those in modern construction on how they could put huge stone slabs together so neatly. And like Babylon, they found a magnifying glass in one of the Egyptian tombs that confirms over again that it is not a modern phenomenon. A papyrus scroll 16 inches wide and at least 6 feet long, found in the early 1820s and dated to the 12th century BC, has been called the Turin Papyrus. It is the oldest geological map in the world. The next known geological map dates from the 1740s. Light bulbs are a new phenomenon to our time. Well, that's what we think. Thomas Edison is credited with patenting the light bulb that has electrified the modern world. But when investigators searched Egyptian tombs and temples, they found no soot or smoke on the roof, and they found giant light bulbs engraved on the walls that are designed exactly as modern bulbs and confirm that they were making electricity from antiquity. And modern research also scratches its head on how pre-dynastic Egypt built such beautiful vases from hard stone vessels. There is much debate over what race the original Egyptians are. Egypt is in Africa, so it is quite obvious. But while Afrocentrists complain that Egyptians are always being played by Europeans in Hollywood blockbusters and continue to exchange heated debates with Western Egyptologists, Egypt received her knowledge from an even older civilization up the Nile. The black population of the Sudan have been unsettled for years, with constant battles with their Islamic Arab neighbors in the north. And even since secession, they are now going through their own domestic and ethnic conflicts among themselves. The imagery we usually have of the Sudan is one of famine, with malnourished children about to be hacked to death by vultures. But incense burners that were unearthed in the Sudan paints a very different picture of this early culture. On closer inspection, scholars at the Smithsonian Institute discovered that the first pharaohs were not to be found in Egypt, but in the Sudan. Evidence of the oldest recognizable monarchy in history, preceding the rise of the earliest Egyptian kings by several generations, has been discovered in artifacts from ancient Nubia in Africa, the New York Times says. Within just a few hundred years, the pharaoh Narmer would forge the entire area into the great Egyptian empire. But recent scholarship shows that the local chiefdoms were already coalescing into larger kingdoms as they were in the neighboring land of Nubia just upriver, Time magazine says. The Sudan has some of the highest number of pyramids on earth, even more than Egypt. They are situated in the north, and because of the almost cult-like hype of Egypt, little is known about them, and one of the reasons for this, as a result of men like Richard Lepsius, who was a pioneering German Egyptologist, linguist and archaeologist, who insisted that the men who built these structures and civilization in the Sudan were Caucasians and not black. He was followed by Bayard Taylor, an American translator and traveler who came to the same conclusion, and George Reisner, an American archaeologist of Egypt and Sudan, gave the most detailed account of this Nubian empire in the Sudan, but also insisted that the blacks did not have the level of intelligence or sophistication to develop such a high civilization. This is Taharqa, the most famous of the black pharaohs, who was from the Sudan, who ruled in the 25th dynasty of Egypt. God was not too impressed that King Hezekiah formed a military alliance with him to defeat the Assyrian king Sennacherib, but God still felt that his name should be preserved in the sacredness of the Holy Scriptures. But the February 2008 edition of National Geographic, which mentions his name, showed that he came from a very deep legacy going back to antiquity. The ancient world was devoid of racism. Famed Egyptologist George Reisner besmirched his own findings by insisting that black Africans could not possibly have constructed the monuments he was excavating. For decades, many historians flip-flopped. Either the Kushite pharaohs were actually white, or they were bumblers, their civilization a derivation of true Egyptian culture. Under Nubian rule, Egypt became Egypt again. Until recently, theirs was a chapter of history that largely went untold. Only in the past 4 decades have archaeologists resurrected their story and come to recognize that the black pharaohs didn't appear out of nowhere. They sprang from a robust African civilization that had flourished on the southern banks of the Nile for 2,500 years, going back at least as far as the first Egyptian dynasty. These Kushites did not only set up the first monarchy in Babylonia and were the first pharaohs in Africa, they did not confine themselves to the Middle East and Africa. They set up the first civilization in another part of the world. The Los Mulattos de Esmeraldas, dated to 1599, is a painting that depicts a father in the center and his 2 sons in Ecuador, who are given the prestigious title as Don. They are adorned with Spanish attire, African spears, and native Indian jewelry. They were descendants of black slaves from Guinea in West Africa who fled from the European slave masters and set up a republic in Ecuador with Indian tribes. In Mexico, an African prince named El Yunga led a slave revolt and set up a community for freed slaves between 1609 to 1630. The descendants of these slaves can still be seen in small pockets throughout Mexico. Many of them are mixed with European and native Indian blood. The British newspaper The London Guardian in 2005 produced a very powerful article on the Mexicanos Negros, or the Afro-Mexicans, as being a highly neglected and ignored group of people. But was this the first time blacks landed in Mexico? In a deep valley called Monte Alban that dates from around 500 BC, there are a number of stone slabs, and carved on them are races of hook-nosed, long-headed Indians, Aryans, Caucasians, Chinese, and black Africans in Mexico. a society with all different races living in harmony, not only shatters the modern so-called failed concept of multiculturalism in the West, but this existed in the Americas, which baffles Western Mesoamerican historians and anthropologists, and this information is very downplayed and hidden from the public. Traditional academics say that the Maya, whose powerfully designed pyramids in the Mexican jungles are the first civilization in Mesoamerica, who were remarkable mathematicians with an advanced technique of metrical calculations, the abstract concept of zero, and were acquainted with place numerations. But the US congressman and writer Ignatius Donnelly asked a very serious question in the 19th century when investigating the early Mesoamerican culture. He said, "How can we account for the representations of Negroes on the monuments of Central America?" This colossus head was unearthed in Mexico, and it was discovered in a region called La Venta. And looking at the facial features, it clearly isn't Mayan. When it was first excavated a number of years ago, the man standing beside it gives us a picture on how big this head is. The American archaeologist Matthew Sterling wrote in National Geographic magazine, volume 76, August 1939, when describing one of these many large colossal heads, he said that the features are bold and amazingly Negroid in character. This woman on the left, who observed this African head at an exhibition, is dwarfed by this colossus artifact carved out of solid rock of a race and civilization that preceded the Maya. When looking at this same head on a side profile on the right, and a head of a Nubian from the Sudan on the left, you clearly see the exact same Kushite features, which are also strikingly similar to the Sphinx at Giza in Egypt. These enormous heads have ruffled the feathers of Orthodox Mesoamerican history, for there are many unanswered questions. These heads are at least 24 tons each in weight, carved out of solid basalt or volcanic rock, which is miles away from the different sites where these heads have been buried. How were these people able to haul such heavy material of stone and carve these colossus heads of these noble rulers, or maybe kings? It is a question that goes unanswered. For years it was always been asserted that the Mesoamerican culture didn't discover the wheel, but no explanation is given how they had wheeled toy dogs in this Mesoamerican culture. The Maya are also meant to create the first writing and mathematical system in Mesoamerica. But in the Daily Telegraph newspaper dated Friday, December 6, 2002, that I preserved, the earliest glyphs preceded the Maya with this African culture, where they have to now rewrite history. But will they do it? When archaeologists look at these heads, just like Egyptology and the denial of the early Kushite kings in the Sudan, there seems to be a very aggressive, intense tug of war to give black Africans their right place in history. For the common belief is that there is no contact between the old and new world prior to Christopher Columbus. But look at these striking similarities. Here is an image of Egyptian Queen Amos Nefertari, who was born in 1562 BC and died in 1495 BC. On her head is depicted the vulture headdress. In the British Museum, this pre-Mayan civilization artifact also wears a similar headdress. The late Thor Heyerdahl was born in 1914 and died in 2002. He was a Norwegian ethnographer and adventurer who wasn't comfortable with the established views that pre-Columbian travel was not possible, and he challenged academic orthodoxy. He wrote a number of books of his voyages, and it got him into trouble and heat with the establishment, not because what he was saying was not true, but that it challenged men's preconceived ideas. When he died in 2002, the British newspaper The Independent wrote a powerful eulogy on his daring exploits. Thor Heyerdahl was born in 1914 in the Norwegian coastal town of Larvik. His love of nature and zoology came from his mother. Heyerdahl believed that there was a link between the cultures of Central America and those which developed on the Nile, the Euphrates, and in the Indus Valley. He had been struck by the similarities between the reed boats depicted on the wall paintings in the Valley of the Kings and those he had seen on ceramic pots in northern Peru. He got Indians from Bolivia to come to Egypt to help build a reed boat, Ra, with 280,000 reeds brought from Lake Tana in the Ethiopian highlands. He built a new boat, Ra II, which crossed successfully from Safi to Barbados in 57 days, abolishing the theory that no boat could have crossed the Atlantic pre-Columbus. The Ra Expeditions was published in 1971. Heyerdahl believed, "We have been blindfolded too long by the European attitude that everything began with us. In reality, many great civilizations throughout the world terminated with our arrival." So pre-Columbian travel has been confirmed by the late Thor Heyerdahl. And in the Egyptian sections in museums, you can see models of boats that were used to once navigate the waters that Thor Heyerdahl modeled his expedition after, where he learned from the natives and was able to navigate successfully a ship from one end of the Atlantic to the other. We have gone back in time, and from the data collated, all authorities confirm that the earliest man in the continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa were all highly civilized from the earliest archaeological, linguistic, and anthropological finds. And by faith, we believe that man was made in God's image, and in this future 3 to 4 part DVD, we will explore this area even deeper. This project, The Origin of Species, will end by looking at recreation, that is, God starting all over again, not with man, but animal species. There is a reason why. The World Wildlife Fund's 2014 report is clear that species are dying out in record numbers, and it cannot be reversed. In the UK alone, 400 species of insects have been wiped out. I filmed this bee with my phone. They are almost becoming extinct also. The last quagga, as can be seen in this London zoo, is a relative to the zebra that became extinct in the 19th century. The thylacine of Tasmania that resembles a dog with stripes like a tiger was actually a marsupial that was driven into extinction. The last one died helpless on its own in a zoo in the 1930s. The rhino is almost dying out also as a result of modern poaching, heading for a similar destination as its relative, the woolly rhino that has died out and has been extinct for thousands of years. Its remains are in museums, and there are portraits on Paleolithic cave art of it in caves in Europe. For thousands of years, the number of species that have become extinct and have been wiped out is just mind-blowing. And today, scientists want to embark on an unethical venture of bringing them back to life. In other words, playing God.
We have learned more in the past decade from genetics than a century of digging up bones. A whole new frontier has opened up. We have our first genetically modified hybrid.
You just went and made a new dinosaur?
Probably not a good idea. Almost 40 feet high. Really think she climbed out?
Depends.
On what?
What kind of dinosaur they cooked up in that lab.
In a project called the Lazarus Project. Today, species eat each other for survival. But in the earth made new, every species on the planet that God will recreate will live in perfect harmony, where God in the book of Isaiah assures us that man and beast will no longer be at war with each other. I will keep you posted on the latest developments and updates for this creation project. In the meantime, just keep watching and looking out for it online.